Walk in the Light, the Caviness family, French Huguenots. Classy, compassionate, and comical, this is Vessie Caviness Green, my great-grandmother, who was born December 17, 1910, into an affluent family in Chatham, Randolph, and Moore counties, North Carolina, to Thomas Brewer and Many Caviness. A descendant of the Caviness, Walden, and Glover families, her family owned thousands of acres in Randolph, Chatham, and Moore counties, North Carolina, and nearly every piece of ground upon which she stepped as a child was owned by her family. She was raised in the Glover's Church that was organized by her family in the 1840s. She was raised in the Glover's Crossroads community, which was owned by her family and named for her family and owned by her family since the 1700s. And she went to school at a school organized by her great-grandfather, Josiah Glover. Her younger brother Ernest was killed by a train, and as the only child of her parents, her future was bright and well planned. She was to marry a man of means and influence with land, go to college, become a nurse, and in time she would inherit a small fortune. A full or half share of her father's estate, 1/3 of her grandfather James Caviness' estate in Chatham County, and 1/3 of her grandmother Sarah Ellen Glover Caviness Brown's estate in Belview. However, she would only inherit a few properties from her family. What happened? 3 words: Henry Sherman Green. Here is her story and that of the Caviness family. Because of their religious beliefs, they fled France to escape persecution and death, and sought refuge in England and then in the colonies in America, and they became known as the Huguenots. Despite being refugees, most were middle and upper-class artisans and professionals, and many were bankers and jewelers. In England, they supported William of Orange and helped him to defeat King James II, and he supported them in their effort to establish a French-speaking colony in Virginia. In the early 1700s, 4 ships of Huguenots came from England to the American colonies. They, however, were not the first, as an earlier group came to New York, and amongst them were the famed jewelers known as Tiffany's. On April 19, 1700, a group boarded the ship Mary and Anne in Gravesend, England, for a 13-week trip to the colony in Virginia. Amongst them was Henry Caviness, his wife, and infant Henry Caviness, Jr. 13 weeks later, on July 13, 1700, they landed on the James River just above present-day Richmond. They were promised land in lower Norfolk County near Jamestown, but instead they were settled in an abandoned Indian village known as Manakin Town. Henry received a land grant. Henry was born in France to Pierre and Anne Saltine Caviness in 1675, December 13, 1675. His wife Marie died in 1706, and he remarried. Their only child was Henry Jr. By his wife Magdalene, he had his child Matthew, George, and Magdalene. Henry Sr. died in August of 1720 in Westover, Prince George County, Virginia, and from his estate inventory we learned he was a fashionable dresser, French dresser, who owned a looking glass, wig, fine hat, great coat, a frock coat, silver shoe buckles, a sword with a silver handle, and large and small gold rings. We also know that he was either a banker or a money changer, as he owned scales to weigh money. Then he also owned books, wine, and a violin. We also know that he was well-read, enjoyed a good drink, and was probably quite entertaining. Henry Jr. was born May 11, 1699 in England. He married Jane Allen. He served in the House of Burgess in Virginia and Williamsburg and produced his own tobacco at his company called the Cavendish Tobacco Company, where he pressed tobacco into old bee gums. As was common in that era, his name was spelled by many various notations: Caviness, 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 and Cavendish, and he is said to have said it didn't matter to him how it was spelled. His children were Henry, Matthew, William, Thomas, Richard, Amos, John Cuit, and Frederick. Our lines continue with not one, but 2 of his sons, Matthew and John Cuit Caviness. His wife, Jane, was the daughter of William and Eleanor Allen and the descendant of the Allens, who built Bacon's Castle in Virginia, which is the oldest brick house in the USA, built in 1665. Our line continues with 2 of Henry Jr.'s sons, Matthew and John Cuit Caviness. Henry Jr. died on December 10, 1774, in Montgomery County, Virginia, and his progeny came to own thousands of acres of land on both sides of the Virginia and North Carolina border. According to a Caviness family historian, later Lord Caviness Anderson, the family prospered until a fever or illness hit the area. and most of them then decided to move south into North Carolina. By late 1798, the crops were gathered, the butchering done, and in early 1799, they sold their farms, loaded their wagons, and started south, leaving behind their lands, which are now underwater in Bugs Island, John Kerr Lake on the Virginia-North Carolina border, state line. There were so many of them that became known as the Caviness Caravan. The Caviness Caravan traveled down the colonial trading path and then down the Bladen Road. When the Caviness Caravan got to the Wallows Ferry on the Deep River, a Negro, 3 years of age, fell into the water and had to be rescued. They considered this a bad omen, and so they went to the north side of the river, near present-day Beulah Baptist Church in Bennett, North Carolina, where Chatham, Moore, and Randolph counties meet, and within a 2-mile range, they bought land near each other. With Matthew buying land in Chatham County and John Cuit buying land in Moore County, this area became known as Caviness Town and Caviness Crossroads. Of Matthew, our line continues with his son John and his wife Elizabeth, also known as Vessie. John died around 1855 in Chatham County, where he owned considerable property. The Caviness family loved family names, and hence this John isn't to be confused with his uncle John Cuit, who is also our ancestor on another line of our family. In 1860, we see living with Vessie her children Eliza, Nancy, Wincy, Sarah, Carrie, Elizabeth, Mary, William, Levi, Josiah, and Jane, and her 4 mulatto grandchildren. This is when during slavery, so they were free: Peter, Francis, Vianetta, Elizabeth, Jesse, and Rebecca. Winnie was born around 1841 in July in Chatham County, and her children were Peter the mulatto, Francis, Jesse, Rebecca, Adeline, Vianetta, Elizabeth, Sally, and Joe Caviness. Our lineage continues with Winnie's daughter, Vianetta, whom she bore by the free black Thomas Marshall Walden. Wincy lived with Vianetta until she died on June 7, 1920, at the age of 80 years, and she was buried in the Walden Cemetery. A mulatto, Vianetta married the white George Brewer, who was the son of Ambrose and Eliza Fuller Brewer in June of 1864. This is confirmed on their records, but also by DNA. And here's his mother. Most of George's family moved out of state, but he and Vianetta owned over 210 acres. He died in 1923 at the age of 85 and was buried in the Glover's Crossroads Cemetery. Their children were Thomas, Jane, Aggie, and the twins George and William McKinley Brewer. Born on September 14, 1899, Thomas Brewer served in the World War and became a considerable property owner in Chatham and Randolph counties, owning both farm land and rental properties. Thomas owned over 230 acres in Chatham County and a number of rental properties in Randolph County. And when he died in the 1970s, his estate was valued at over in excess of $500,000. Melvin Marley, who took part in the Asheboro sit-ins, told a reporter there was a man in East Asheboro who owned considerable property, who owned much of property in East Asheboro, and he signed a lot of bonds to bail out protesters during the sit-in movement in Asheboro. He also married Annie Walden, Lily Green, and Roxy, and he outlived all but one. One of the people that Thomas came to employ as a sharecropper on one of his many properties was Henry Sherman Green, son of Henry O. and Adelaide Wumble Green. Henry told the story often of how he was working for Mr. Brewer, Mr. Tom, in his fields, and he saw his beautiful white daughter on the front porch, and he decided that day to marry her. So each day he would work harder and faster to get to the front porch, and finally he did. And he spoke to Mr. Brewer and asked if he could take her on a hayride. Mr. Brewer gave permission to do so. It is doubtful that he would have given him permission had he known the outcome, as Henry was not deemed a proper husband for Vessie. But on Christmas Day, 1927, the two eloped and interrupted the plans of the family for Vessie's and her life. And the Vessie's family never hid their disdain for Sherman. Our Caviness ancestry, however, is not limited to Thomas Brewer's line, but also that of his great-grandfather Matthew Cavenness's brother, John Cuit Caviness. According to Lord Caviness Anderson, John Cuit Caviness was a soldier, and he was a soldier in the War for Independence, and he married Sarah Solomon, who was 12 years his junior, whose father was also a soldier along with John Cuit. And in this family are many doctors and teachers and reverends. So many so they're not called by their last name, but by their first name, because there's so many doctors, ministers, and teachers. And there is a family burial ground called the Dolly Graveyard, where both the white and black members of the family, who were all free, were buried. John Cuit was born in Virginia and died in Moore County in 1803, having mustered out in Warrenton, North Carolina. His children are an unknown infant, John Blackjack, so called because he was very dark, William James Daniel, who married Susanna Lane Purvis and later son of Kid, Mariah, and Dolly, Iron Sister's Dolly. Mariah also had mixed kids, as did Dolly, or had grandkids. Sidney Sneed Caviness, a relative and great-grandson of Wency Caviness, who is also our ancestor and not to be confused with her cousin, Winnie Caviness, wrote in October of 98 and said, "My great-grandmother Wency Caviness was a white woman born and raised in the South in 1819. Even though she was white and a Southerner, who in a slave society, she was good-hearted and knew even back then that slavery was wrong and wanted to see it abolished. She hated slavery with all her being. And an incident happened one day that she saw that was the last straw. She saw a slave being violently mistreated, and it so upset her that she made this vow: she would never give birth to a slaveholder. Therefore, she would never have a child by a white man. She said she would free as many brown children as she could by giving birth to them, because if the mother was white, then the children was born free." This story can't be refuted or validated, but we do know that she did have children, and they were all free. And that also this area was a hotbed for Quakers who were abolitionists. We descend from Wency's daughter, St. Frances, who was the mother of James Caviness, who was named for her uncle, James D. Caviness, whom she lived near for a period. Born March 7th, and here's a family tree of Wency's family. Born March 7th, 1862, to Francis and General Branson Walden, James Caviness, or Jim, our ancestor, was a beekeeper also, and we see him here with his daughter Nettie, and he built a two-story house on the property that he owned abroad in the Glover's Crossroad community. Around 1886, he married his cousin, Sarah Ellen Glover, daughter of Josiah, Joe, and Frances Adelaide Smith Glover, and Jim and Sarah, the parents of Nettie Caviness, Rose Ethel Caviness Walden, and Zebbedee Paul Caviness. He was a farmer, but he is best remembered for being a beekeeper. His grandson, James Wilbert Green, my grandfather, is named for him. Jim died on January 1st, 1952, at the age of 91, and his wife, Sarah, had divorced him earlier and remarried Henry Brown and moved to Belview. Their children were Rose Ethel Caviness, again, who married Joseph Haywood Walden, Nettie Caviness, and Zebbedee Paul Caviness. And we see here Zeb and Nettie Caviness living with James, or Jim Caviness, in 1910, and Ethel with her husband in 1910. Two first cousins in Belview, Vessie Caviness Green and Evelyn Homan Williams. Evelyn Homan Williams was a daughter of Gertrude Foy Holman, who was a neighbor of Zeb's mother, Sarah Ellen Glover Caviness Brown, and Zeb, on Oriole Street in Belview. Evelyn had one son, Hary Holman, who was known as Jitterbug, who was a veteran, an executive in the Shell Oil Company, and an HR for many chains. He and his wife Mary are the parents of Zoltan, who married Stephanie, and Danica Holman, who live in Houston, Texas. Zeb's sister, Nettie, was the mother of Vessie Caviness, who married Henry Sherman Green. And their children are Helen Green Walker, Henry Sherman Green, Colleen Green Leak, Thelma Green Robinson, who is not pictured, and Anna Lee Green Pettigrew. And here we see a picture of the Caviness Green family reunion. And we are proud to say that our family has been in this country for 15 generations. I am in the 12th generation, and there are 3 generations more beyond me. Au revoir. Until we see each other again. Thank you so much. Please like my page and share this video. Spencer McCall, Jr.